Pressure volume loops are graphs where the pressure inside the left ventricle is on the y-axis and the volume of the left ventricle is on the x-axis. Each loop represents one cardiac cycle, including both ventricular systole and diastole, or more simply, one heartbeat. Alright, let's start at the lower right-hand corner. This is the end diastolic point, and it's the point in the cardiac cycle when diastole is over. The mitral valve, or the communicating door, between the left atrium and the left ventricle has just closed. And as it closed, it made a long, loud sound, kind of like a... That's known as the first heart sound, or S1. So at this point, the left ventricle is filled with a maximum volume of blood, known as the end diastolic volume, which is normally about 120 millilitres. You can imagine the ventricle as a relaxed sac of muscle that's full of blood, so the pressure is low. After that, the left ventricle contracts, and that marks the beginning of systole. This makes the pressure shoot up, but since both mitral and aortic valves are closed, blood can neither enter nor leave the ventricle, so the volume doesn't change. This phase is called isovolumetric contraction, and it lasts for about 0.05 seconds. Eventually, the pressure inside the left ventricle reaches approximately 75 millimeters of mercury, becoming just higher than the pressure inside the aorta, forcing the aortic valve to pop open. This pressure reflects the pressure in the aorta right at the beginning of the ejection phase, or the lowest that the blood pressure in the aorta is going to be, and it's known as the diastolic blood pressure, or DBP for short. Okay, now, once the ejection phase starts, it lasts for about 0.25 seconds. That's when blood is ejected out of the left ventricle and into the aorta, decreasing left ventricular volume. The left ventricle continues to contract, so ventricular pressure keeps rising further. Meanwhile, blood is rushing through the aorta, so its pressure increases as well. In fact, during this phase, left ventricular and aortic pressures are essentially equal. This goes on until they reach a peak of about 120 millimeters of mercury, known as systolic blood pressure, or SBP, before finally starting to come down again. The difference between systolic and diastolic blood pressures, in this case 120 minus 75, equals 45 millimeters of mercury, and this is called pulse pressure, because it reflects the throbbing pulsation felt in an artery during systole. Eventually, aortic pressure exceeds the pressure within the left ventricle, so the aortic valve snaps shut. As it does this, it makes a short, sharp sound, kind of like a... And this is called the second heart sound, or S2. So, this marks the end of the systolic period, also known as end systolic point. At this point, the volume inside the left ventricle, known as the end systolic volume, is normally about 50 millilitres. If we calculate the difference between the end diastolic volume and the end systolic volume, we'll get the stroke volume, which is the volume of blood the left ventricle ejects, or simply squeezes away, on every heartbeat or stroke during this ejection period. In this case, 120 minus 50 is a stroke volume of 70 millilitres. Stroke volume is a useful measurement, but it can vary based on the size of the person's heart. So another helpful measurement is the ejection fraction, which is the stroke volume divided by the end diastolic volume. In this example, it's 70 divided by 120, which is about 58%. In other words, 58% of the blood volume in the left ventricle gets pumped out during each heartbeat. Once the aortic valve has closed, the ventricular muscle starts relaxing, so pressure within the ventricle falls. However, all valves are closed, so the volume remains consistent. This is the isovolumetric relaxation phase, and it lasts for about 0.15 seconds. Eventually, the pressure drops below the left atrial pressure, and that allows the mitral valve to open. Due to the pressure gradient, blood from the atrium flows into the ventricle, at the beginning passively and at the end with an extra push due to the atrial contraction. As the left ventricle fills with blood, its volume comes back up to 120 millilitres, or its end diastolic volume, while its pressure increases only slightly. Actually, this relaxation phase goes on for kind of a long time period compared to the previous phases, about 0.55 seconds, until there's no more pressure gradient between the two heart chambers, and the mitral valve closes, letting the cycle start all over again. All this happens during one heartbeat. And with every heartbeat, or stroke, the heart is doing work, and that's called stroke work, and it's proportional to the area inside the loop. In other words, the bigger the loop and the more area inside of it, the more stroke work our heart does. Alright, as a quick recap, pressure volume loops are graphs showing the changing relationship between the left ventricular pressure and the left ventricular volume during a cardiac cycle. Pressure volume loops can provide us with useful information such as stroke volume or end diastolic volume, as well as systolic, diastolic and pulse pressure.
Helping current and future clinicians focus, learn, retain, and thrive. Learn more